Whilst on the topic of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, another thing in the UK, because of the distance and the modern disconnection between the UK and the colonial states that it set up, is the feeling of an argument by some and a feeling of futility by others that people in the UK and the government, the nation, can't really do as much to influence the course of events in other countries and reconcile with Indigenous peoples. That, first of all, ignores the real connections and influences that Britain has between Canada, much more than the United States. But also, Britain, despite not doing too well at the moment, is still one of the richest countries in the world, even if not all that wealth is in the hands of a majority of people. It still has a lot of wealth. So I think we can spare a few pennies for a little bit of reparations to Indigenous people. Furthermore, as I've already mentioned, the most direct thing that can be done is the repatriation of Indigenous objects that reside in museums. This discussion is, as I've seen, almost always framed as whether something was stolen. I'm here to argue, and as I found and then argued in the paper that I put forward, that functionally it doesn't matter how Europeans acquired the stuff from Indigenous people. If it was taken or stolen, that of course makes it worse. But even in the cases where they were freely given from Indigenous people to Europeans, in 99% of cases, at least all the cases that I have found, they served the purposes of colonialism. First, by justifying colonialism. Lots of objects were taken, whether they were given or not, and people in the Enlightenment argued, this is evidence that they are a primitive society at the lower end of civilization. In the 19th century, with the invention of scientific racism, all that skull measuring and such, that it was argued that the physical biology of a people could distinguish them in terms of their civilizedness, that biology could determine how civilized a people were. That created the impetus to collect even more Indigenous artifacts, but also their human remains, which in many cases were just taken, like after battles in the US Army would collect all of the remains of Indigenous killed to send to institutions like the Smithsonian. And then, at the same time in history, opposed to the scientific racists were those who instead believed that Indigenous peoples were uncivilized because of their natural environment. And if they changed their environment, like making them wear Western clothes and do Western things, they'd become European. And as a part of that, they decided to take Indigenous artifacts to understand their culture, to best find ways to destroy it. And within all these ideas, there was the agreed upon idea that it was inevitable that Indigenous culture would die out. And therefore, it was perfectly reasonable to collect all their stuff, because once they were gone, there'd be no more evidence for them to do so. They could put it in museums. In spite of all these colonial efforts, of course, Indigenous people survived, and with a impressive amount of their culture intact. And yet, to this day, particularly in European countries detached from Indigenous peoples, museums seem to act as if the artifacts that they've collected are still from a culture that no longer exists, with no reference to the peoples who still live here and who would very much like their artifacts of cultural significance back. Of course, beyond just justifying colonialism, the acquisition of all these artifacts directly served as a part of it. This was primarily due to the fact that as much as academic institutions like museums and universities said that they were doing this to preserve Indigenous history and learn from it, they sure as hell destroyed a lot of the knowledge associated with these artifacts in the process of their collecting. The specific example that I used was several Blackfoot shirts that were in the Pitt Rivers Museum and have now been returned to the Blackfoot. 3 of the 5 shirts that they had were hairlock shirts. And hairlock shirts are immense religious, cultural and personal significance to the people who own them. First of all, the concept of the hairlock shirt itself was a gift from the sun, alongside a religious ceremony called the sun dance. Meaning that both of these things are just as sacred. The hairlock shirts themselves had a personal dimension to them, since they belonged to specific warriors. And the hairlock part of the shirt is when a warrior raided a horse in battle, or successfully raided a horse from enemies, or killed and scalped an enemy, they would take the hair from that scalped person and the hair from the horses that had been raided, wove them together into locks of hair, and then attach them to this shirt as physical evidence of their capabilities and achievements. And it therefore acted as a way to remember all of the stories and the achievements of that person. The record of how first the Hudson's Bay Company, who then gave them to the Pitt Rivers Museum, acquired these 3 shirts are missing. And so we don't know exactly the circumstances for which they were given or taken, for which they were acquired. But as academics who have researched this far better than me, it is very likely that they were given as a gift, as they sometimes were. But unlike the Blackfoot, who could appreciate the significance of these shirts, and who had the stories of who these shirts belonged to and the people that were attached to them, the Hudson's Bay Company, partially through their records being destroyed, and though mostly due to the fact that they didn't care enough to record it, couldn't record the immense breadth and depth of the history and the knowledge associated with the shirts. They might be able to appreciate some level of the spiritual and cultural significance, as I have done. But Indigenous history was recorded in an oral manner. And as the historian who researched this put it, they didn't care enough to comprehensively record and understand this knowledge and then transfer that to the Pitt Rivers Museum. And because we don't know who these shirts originally belonged to, all of the knowledge, all of the context, all of the history associated with these objects is gone, lost, and we'll likely never have it ever again. So the argument by institutions, and I don't know if they've made the specific argument, but I'm sure they've made it in the past, by institutions like the Pitt Rivers Museum, who in the past have argued that they have these objects to preserve history and historical understanding, have only done more damage by keeping these artefacts, by first acquiring and then keeping these artefacts. And there is a far lower chance that the history of these objects will be re-established by them having been kept in institutions like the Pitt Rivers Museum. This applies to so many objects, not just from Indigenous people of North America, but from across the world. I suspect you could easily apply this argument. You could easily also apply this argument to the Benin bronzes, which has been an object of particular media interest for this whole discussion. On a wider scale, there is an argument that I've seen far too often from institutions like the British Museum, who argue that academic institutions like them are far better at preserving these artefacts than the peoples who originally owned them would be. First of all, there's the simple argument of it isn't the British's cultural property that they have. Where in Britain, it requires an academic institution like the British Museum, who I have no doubt are committed to ensuring these items are not destroyed. Implicitly quite racist view to believe that the people who these artefacts belong to, who have a far greater amount of cultural significance for, would somehow not be capable of preserving them, where they had been doing so for centuries beforehand. This argument is also discredited by the fact that academic institutions like the British Museum have no legs to stand on when they claim to be able to preserve historical items better than other people. And the prime example I used for this was a site called the Dalles in the United States. The Dalles was a meeting place for Indigenous people for thousands of years, and as a result, the amount of sort of archaeological material there that's accumulated, both from people living it intentionally and unintentionally, is immense. Unsurprisingly, the moment Europeans arrived, amateur archaeologists began pilfering the area for artefacts to sell to the general public, despite the fact that Indigenous people were still using the site. But then in the 1950s, there was a great impetus to excavate everything, because the US Army Engineer Corps were building a dam, and that dam would flood a vast area, including which would mean a vast amount of archaeological material would be destroyed. Of course, Indigenous people weren't asked if they wanted that dam to be built on lands that they were still using, as they had been doing for thousands of years. Nor were they asked if they would like the area to be excavated, which would include the excavation of hundreds of burial areas, some of which included remains of Indigenous people that had only been buried years, singular, not decades, years before. They were not contacted at all about how things should proceed. Instead, the army went to the Smithsonian. Smithsonian went to the local universities of Washington and Oregon, who then got a bunch of student volunteers to go out and excavate things. Unfortunately for them, there was so much stuff. There are about 10 sites that they believed they needed to excavate, but that would all take too long with the amount of people they had. And so, what do you think that these universities did? Do you think that they left well alone and took in the protestation of Indigenous peoples not to excavate the area they didn't want excavated? Did they go to Indigenous people and ask, oh, maybe you could have some help? Perhaps we can share and understand the history here and do things on your terms. No, they did none of those things. They went, instead of going to Indigenous people, straight to all those amateur archaeologists that have been pilfering the area for generations. They needed them as volunteers to excavate as much as possible as quickly as possible. However, of course, because of this, they could not control the discipline of their excavation. Nor could they completely control if these amateur collectors just dug something up and thought, oh, that's interesting, I'll take that home with me. Nor could they control the discipline of these amateurs when excavating stuff. This included, at one moment, a volunteer using a bulldozer in an archaeological dig. I hope I don't need to explain why that probably has destroyed a mass amount of history. As I also mentioned, a fair number of the burials that they would have excavated in the area were from people who had been buried less than decades before. And of course they targeted the graves specifically because they, one, had human remains, which were interesting, and two, because they had a bunch of funerary objects with them, which were also the most interesting objects they could acquire. Not even accounting for the fact that Indigenous people weren't contacted or talked to at all about these excavations, is the arrangement they came to with these amateur archaeologists. Whilst the academic institutions of the universities managed to acquire all of the human remains, all of the other artifacts were distributed amongst the different parties. The universities got a third. The Oregon Archaeological Society got another third. And another third was distributed among innumerable volunteers who have no obligation to even report that they had these things. This means that the massive amount of funerary objects which came with the human remains of these people were distributed and scattered across the United States and probably the world. Such incidents of not taking into account Indigenous protests when it came to human remains continued all the way into the 1970s. In 1971, when there was a highway being built in Iowa, a historical graveyard was uncovered with, I believe, 27 or 26 individuals in it. All but one of those remains were found to be Caucasian, and they were all reburied in coffins. The one Indigenous woman among them was taken to the state's Archaeological Institute. It was only because of protests led by Indigenous people that 5 years later, this woman was finally reburied, and state laws were changed to ensure this wouldn't happen again. It would also take another few decades until a national law to resolve these issues would be created, resulting in 1989 and 1991 with NAGPRA, which is an acronym I can't remember what exactly it stands for. A law in the United States that mandated all academic institutions return the human remains of Indigenous peoples they found, along with the objects associated with them. A similar law was passed in 2007 at the UN, with another act with an acronym that I can't remember. And even then, this UN declaration was specifically voted against by none other than the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Although they have since changed their positions, though considering the current American administration, I wouldn't be surprised if they changed their opinion again. Those laws in 1991 allowed for the return of the human remains that were taken from the Dalles back in the 50s, along with the funeral objects associated with them. Apart from, of course, all the objects that were distributed among those innumerable private individuals. Tracking all them down is a job that will likely take decades, if not centuries. Suffice to say that the argument that academic institutions are better at preserving history is not a particularly convincing one, considering their record. This was, of course, this is a long-winded way of saying that there is much to be done in the UK, despite the fact that it may be that the United Kingdom and its government may not have as direct a way to influence events in its former colonies as it did decades previously. It is still possible. People in the UK and in other European countries are better placed than Indigenous people here in Canada to lobby and protest their academic institutions, like the British Museum, to hand back the artefacts and human remains that they still possess. Which in the UK would also require lobbying the government, since lobbying government and Parliament, considering that it is an act of Parliament that actively prevents the British Museum from returning objects it has. Now, I'm realising I didn't come out here intending to turn the 4,000 word essay I wrote into a however long it's been rant, but you can see how passionate I am about this subject. Back to the purpose of what I came out here to do anyway. I think I'm reaching my limit in terms of how far my legs will be able to carry me.